My name's John. I think I've met most of the people here tonight. If I haven't met you, please come talk to me after. Come talk to me next week. I'd love to meet you guys. I've been attending Lift Church now for just over 3 years. I started coming. There was a speaker who came in. I came once. I fell in love with it. I really love Lift. I call this church my home, and I'm very excited because you can see what we've been doing, in the community, how God's been using us, and how people are coming to know God through us in both Hamilton and on campus, and it's really, really awesome. This is my first time speaking, actually, for a church service. So I'm really, really excited. Robin's given me the honor, and he asked me to continue with this series on Deuteronomy called Just Do It. And to be honest, I was a little bit nervous when he first told me to speak on Deuteronomy. I've spoken just a couple times in the men's ministry here at Lift, and usually I go to the New Testament or to the Gospel, the letters of Paul, but I'm really excited to speak from Deuteronomy because I do really believe that both the Old Testament and the New Testament are perfectly relevant to our life, and there's stuff that we can learn from both of them. So, without any further ado, can you guys open up your Bible to Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 through 15, and let me know when you guys are there. I know it's the cheesy thing for pastors to say, but it is kind of helpful. Deuteronomy 5, chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. You're all there? All right, so I'm going to read it quick. This is one of the 10 commandments. This is Moses saying it, and it goes, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." I realize you guys have the NLT on the screens here. I have the NIV that I'm reading from in my notes, so a little bit different, same meaning though. So if you didn't catch it, what Robin's asked me to speak on, ironically, as he's away practicing rest, is the Sabbath day and rest. And before I start, I wanted to reiterate what Robin's been saying for the past couple of weeks. In this series where we look at the Old Testament laws, we're not looking at them to say, these are the confines and the restrictions that God gave to the Israelites, but rather we look at them because God gave them to the Israelites to say, this is the framework of what it is to be people who serve God. As I was reading the law of the Sabbath, it's the fourth one of the 10 commandments, as I said. The first thing that stuck out to me was that it's clearly got importance. Growing up, I kind of viewed it as like a secondary law, I guess, something that's kind of on the side, something that, Sundays is the Sabbath, okay, I get it. But there's got a lot of significance in it. God's put it right in the 10 commandments. He's put it behind, you shall have no other gods before me. You should not make idols or false images. You should not use the Lord's name in vain. And then you need to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Clearly the Sabbath day is a very important thing, and God's put it there for a reason when he's put it in the 10 commandments, and Moses has said it again in Deuteronomy for a reason. It's very important. Why do we need it? Why do we need this Sabbath day? I think we all have different relations to work. Some of us are students full-time. Some of us have full-time jobs. Some of us volunteer. We take part in ministry or with charities full-time. Some of us support the company Netflix full-time. Some of us are full-time binge watchers. We all have different relations to work, but we all have something that we put our time and our labor into. We're all committed somewhere with that. And while I was researching for this message, while I was reading through different articles, listening to sermons, I came across a really well-written article, and I think it's written by Judith Shulevitz, a difficult name, but she really hits it on the head. She looks at our relation to work and how the Sabbath affects that. And Judith Shulevitz is a New York Times journalist for the Book Review, and she's actually a Jewish background. She grew up with Judaism as her religion, and then as she got older, she turned away from it. Turned to secularism, and she puts it really well, so I wanted to read some from the article. If you guys want to read it later, it's called Bring Back the Sabbath, and she says, "About a decade ago, I developed a full-blown weekend disorder of my own. My mood would darken until by Saturday afternoon, I'd be unresponsive and morose. My normal routine made me feel impossibly restless. I started spending Saturdays by myself. After a while, I got lonely and did something that, as a teenager profoundly put off by her religious education, I could never have imagined wanting to do. I began dropping in on a nearby synagogue. Ours is a society that pegs status to overachievement. We can't help but admire workaholics. Let me argue instead on behalf of an institution that has kept workaholism in reasonable check for thousands of years. Most people mistakenly believe that all you have to do to stop working is not work. The inventors of the Sabbath understood that it was a much more complicated undertaking. You cannot downshift casually and easily. This is what the Puritan and Jewish Sabbaths were so exactingly intentional. The rules did not exist to torture the faithful. They were meant to communicate the insight that interrupting the ceaseless round of striving requires a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one that has to be bolstered by habit as well as social sanction. If previously people had suffered from the Sabbath, I was suffering from lack thereof. So what is she saying in this article? What's she trying to get at? And she's saying, the Sabbath day, to take part in Sabbath, it's not merely a stopping of work. If you're looking for your rest in simply the physical, I'm not doing what I would do the rest of the week, you're not going to find it there. Our culture has this interesting relationship to work where formerly it was something that we did and we were maybe identified by our family role. We'd be a mother, a father, a brother, sister, son, daughter. Now we're identified by what we do. I don't think it would take much convincing to convince you guys that on campus, one of the most common questions you'll hear is, so what are you taking? What are you studying? What are you here for? Or if I'm at work, that changes to, so what do you do? What company do you work for? What's your role in this? It's kind of shifted to where we define by the position that we've reached instead of formerly where it was that role. And we work towards that position so that will stand out to the people around us. And we get the mindset of, if we can reach this position, once I get that GPA, once I make those grades, or once I finish this program, then I'll have reached it. Once I get into the management role, then I'll reach it. Once I get that dream job, I'll reach it. And the reason that we see so much burnout across the board is because that kind of striving never ends. I don't have to explain to you guys the burnout very much. You guys, if you're in school or if you're in work, you've seen it. If you look at Spotted at Mac, even the Facebook page, you'll see constant posts about people who have mental struggles because they can't cope with the pressures of school. And it doesn't change when you get to work either, guys. I work full time, and even with a bunch of grown men on a construction site, the pressures of work, the pressures of trying to reach and to be this are real, and they're so prevalent, and they equal that burnout. And I think God gives this command, and then Moses reiterates it. Moses says it again to the Israelites before they go into the promised land for a reason. And it's not because of today. It's not because of our culture. It's not a reason to say, oh, well, now, I'm a Christian, so I get a day off. I take Sundays off now. Workaholics, that wasn't a thing thousands of years ago. This command was relevant like thousands of years ago, and it is relevant today because humans have a problem with finding identity in the wrong things. That's why God's giving this command. The work to prove yourself and your identity is work that will never let you rest. No amount of leisure, no amount of physical rest is going to leave you feeling rested if that's your goal. Sabbath rest is not simply a stopping of work to spend time in community or come to church on Sunday. And while those things are great, and I really encourage them, Sabbath rest is so much more. See, in the article, Judith Shulevitz understood it when she says, the Sabbath is not simply a time to stop work, but it's a time to stop the eternal inner murmur of self-reproach. It's time to stop and recognize what God has done in us. Sabbath rest is a deep spiritual rest where we stop our mind, we stop the striving, the thinking about this world and what we got to do and what we've got to be to focus on God. And if that's the why, we need spiritual rest. We need that rest because, or else it'll never end. The striving will never end. Then the next point would be, where do we get it? It's not just enough to say we need it, but we got to know where. And I wanted to look at how Jesus deals with it. Jesus, when he has his time of ministry on earth, the Sabbath is even more prevalent in that culture than it is now. It was very, very well observed. So if you guys could open to Luke chapter 6. Verses 1 to 11. Let me know when you're there. I think it's going to come up on the screen anyways, to be honest. So if you're not there, it's okay. I'll read it from the screen this time with the NLT. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples broke off heads of grains, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grain. But some Pharisees said, "Why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath?" Jesus replied, "Haven't you read in scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priest can eat. He also gave some to his companions, and Jesus added, 'The Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath.' On another Sabbath day, a man with a deformed hand was in the synagogue while Jesus was teaching. The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees watched Jesus closely to see if he would heal the man's hand. They planned to cause him of working on the Sabbath. I think it means accuse there. But Jesus knew their thoughts. He said to the man with the deformed hand, 'Come and stand in front of everyone.' So the man came forward. Then Jesus said to his critics, 'I have a question for you. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this the day to save life or to destroy it?' He looked around at them one by one, and then said to the man, 'Hold out your hand.' So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. At this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss what to do about him." So a little bit of context for the passage that we just read there. The time of Jesus' ministry, there was the Pharisees who were the main religious group, then them and the Sadducees. But the Pharisees are in this particular story. And they see Jesus, and they're looking to accuse him of something. So they pick out one of the 39 rules that they've had made themselves in addition to the Sabbath rule to keep the Sabbath day holy. These were the 39 don't do's so that you could properly observe the Sabbath. So one of them is you can't thresh grain, which is when they were rubbing it to take the husks off the grain, that was considered threshing, and you can't heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus' response to them saying, "Hey, how are you're breaking these rules?" He immediately goes to scripture to a story from 1 Samuel when David and his men were running for their lives and they eat the bread from the tabernacle, which was actually, it was against the law because it was holy bread and it was part of the Sabbath day worship. And Jesus is pointing out to them, he's showing them that he's breaking the Sabbath rules. And it kind of struck me, what is he saying by that, Is Jesus saying it's a flexible rule? The Sabbath is flexible, don't worry about it. I mean, if you're too busy, if you don't feel like coming to church, if you don't feel like observing a Sabbath, don't worry about it. It's only when you really want to, it's only an occasional thing. And I don't think he's saying that at all, He's not saying you guys can bend the Sabbath to whatever you want it, Put your own twist on it, take it, bend it how you want it. I think Jesus disregards the rules of the Sabbath, not because the Sabbath is irrelevant, but rather because the Pharisees missed the theme of it. Jesus breaks the rules of the Sabbath, not because the day itself, not because Sabbath is irrelevant, because the Pharisees have missed the point. So what is the point of the Sabbath? Jesus answers it there when he says, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. And that's a really big statement. So I want to go into it a little bit. I'm going to go into it a little bit. But if you look back at the 10 Commandments when they were first given in Exodus, not Deuteronomy, the last kind of verse, instead of saying, I've brought you out of slavery, God's brought you out of slavery, he says, observe the seventh day, keep it holy, because, God created 6 days on the world, and then on the seventh day rested. And I think it's important to recognize that first and recognize that God didn't rest on the seventh day because he was tired. God wasn't like, 6 days of creation. Tomorrow I am sleeping in, I'm going to wake up, have a nice big breakfast. I'm going to sit down, maybe watch a little bit of Netflix. Jesus wasn't resting on the seventh day because he was tired physically. He was resting because it was completed. He was resting because it was good. So when Jesus says, the Son of Man, which is Jesus himself, so he's saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath. He's saying to the Pharisees, you've missed the point. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. The 39 rules you've completed, they're not found in that. Sabbath is found in me. Sabbath rest is found in me. And how can he say that so boldly? It's actually ironically, the Pharisees in that chapter have a part to play in it. So at the end, his enemies get together and discuss, how are we going to deal with this guy? And if you've heard the gospel, if you've read the gospel, you'll know that they do it by crucifying Jesus. They kill him on the cross. And the great irony is that's what actually makes him Lord over the Sabbath. Because of Jesus' death on the cross, the work is completed. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath because he died on the cross and completed the work that we could have not done on our own. See, God rested because it was completed. And before, we're trying to strive. We'll never complete that striving. If we aim for the worldly things, we'll never make it. Even our own righteousness, we all fall short of righteousness. Yet when Jesus came and died on the cross, he completed the work. When we stand before God, we don't stand on our merit. We don't say, God, I worked pretty hard, I even preached one Sunday. I've worked pretty hard. Come on. We stand in the merit of God. There's no difference in the work that I've done. It's all about the work of Jesus. And we will never find that the work is done in the world. But with Jesus, we can stand in the righteousness that he earned. We can rest because we are complete in him, and the sin that we once carried died on the cross with him. We find rest in Jesus because we have a new righteous identity found in him that won't be changed by any amount of work we do here. If that's where we get it, we get our rest in Jesus, in that sacrifice, in the fact that he's done the work for us, then how do we step into it? This was a really big one for me. This is something that I'm still trying to learn how to adequately step into the Sabbath rest. And even writing this, I'm learning so much. I'm not coming from a place where 3 years ago I figured this all out, so I think it's about time I should tell you guys. It's coming. I'm learning this just as well. I'm walking through this. And I wanted to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 5, and in verse 15, I'm going to read the NIV because that's what I've got here. But this verse has really struck me in the past year almost about it. And looking at it, it goes, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath." So I was saying, Sabbath rest has been something that's really been on my heart. And for me, I grew up, both my parents were Christians, and both of them were very intent on following the Sabbath. And there was a bunch of things, we'd all get up, all 4 kids get up Sunday morning, we'd all get dressed, we'd eat breakfast as a family, we'd go to our church, we'd do church, we'd either come home or we'd go to somebody else's house and have coffee and cookies. And if you've ever been in Dutch Reform settings, that always follows church. That was always a thing that came after. And then, right? It's not a bad thing, I'm just saying. And then, maybe depending on the day, we'd go to church at night again. And there was also a bunch of things that we couldn't do. There was things like shopping. So we couldn't go to the grocery store. But not only the grocery store, we couldn't shop in general. I mean, we couldn't go to Tim Hortons because if we were going to buy a coffee, somebody would have had to work to make it for us, even though we'd go to someone else's house and have coffee. I don't know. But, right? The things when you're a kid and you're like, why? Because I'm the parent. But it was also a list of things we couldn't do. We couldn't shop, we couldn't play on any sports team that would have games on Sundays. And we couldn't work either. When I was really young, it didn't matter. I wasn't doing work. But then as I got older, we couldn't work. And while my parents did relax as time went along, as I got older, those things became more relaxed. I will frequently buy food from Union Market here on Sundays. The one thing I stuck with, no work on Sundays. I never took a shift on Sundays. Now my job doesn't actually require me to even come in on Sundays. And it didn't actually, I didn't notice a lack of Sabbath rest until, ironically, I started ministry here. Until I started doing the men's ministry. I lead it with Jong, who's not here today. But until I started that, I didn't notice the lack of Sabbath rest. And at the time, I was working, I was doing school, and that hasn't changed so much. I'm still doing all those things, but I never felt rested. And it was really confusing for me because I was pretty worn out, but then I'd come to God and I'd be like, God, I don't understand, I'm doing what you've called me. I'm doing your work, I'm spending time in the ministry, but I come in every day and I feel tired, and I leave every day and I feel tired. I'd come in, I'd be on worship on Sunday, I'd come in feeling tired and worn out, I'd play my guitar, and then I'd leave feeling tired and worn out. I would go to Forge, and I would come in feeling tired and worn out, and I would leave feeling tired and worn out. And it was confusing. I was praying about it, and one thing that I really had to learn was actually how to step into the Sabbath rest, how to take it, and it's still something that I'm learning. But a big thing that I realized is anything that I couldn't put down to spend time with God was controlling me, and I was still a slave to it. Anything that you can't put down to spend time with God, you're still a slave to it. We read verse 15 where God's brought us out of that slavery, but if we still go back to it, we're still a slave to it. Can you imagine if Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, they have their big celebration, they're loving it, and then first thing he does is right back to Pharaoh, and he's like, okay, if there's any work you need me to do, I'll be back, just let me know, give me a call if you need anything, if you ever have any work, I'd come back. Like, it doesn't work. Once we're called out of slavery, we can't go back to it and put that as our goal again, right? You call that a slavery to move forward in God's calling. If you ask any sleep expert, they're going to tell you that the quality of sleep is more important than quantity. If I sit and I take 8 one-hour naps in a day, I'm not going to feel very rested. I'm not going to feel nearly as rested as if I took an 8-hour sleep at night. And there's sometimes a delusion between what is a nap and what is a sleep for me sometimes. I trick myself into thinking I'm taking a nap and then I end up asleep. But the quality of sleep is more important than the quantity, right? And the same was true with my prayer life. I was coming in and I was saying, God, where I have time, I'm going to pray. When I have time, I'll read my Bible. And I would say, I have 30 minutes here. Great, so I'll slot that in there. I'll do that, Maybe when I come home, if I have a little bit of time before I run to this, I'll read my Bible and I'll spend some time in devotions. I'll go to church on Sundays, but only if I have too much homework, I'm not coming. I was delaying it. I was setting apart God's time into whatever little space and nook and cranny that I could find. And I was not getting the deep rest, the real time with God. See, I didn't trust my time with God. If I can't set aside my job or my school or my ministry to spend time with God, I'm a slave to whatever I can't do. So even if it's my ministry, I'm a slave to my ministry if I can't step aside to spend time with God. And actually, you see Robin right now is praying and spending time with God. He's in Kentucky, I think. But he's stepped aside from Sunday to spend time with God. He's not going to be driven by a ministry. Robin seeks after God. And that's something that I had to learn so desperately because I couldn't get rest without it. I was having these little smidgets of time with God, but I would never spend that real scheduled rest time with God. The Sabbath rest requires intentionally and wholeheartedly putting time with God first in your schedule. You're not walking in the freedom of God if you can't stop what you're doing to spend time with God, even if it's ministry. And really practically talking, there's a couple things that I had to learn going forward with this. There's a couple of things that it's a practice too. Sabbath is a practice, and I had to learn these things to adequately spend that time with God. And the first thing I wanted to touch on, and it sounds cheesy, like it's the typical Christian thing to say, but accountability. And not the accountability like, man, that was a hefty sermon. I'll pray for you now. You pray for me. Maybe in a month I'll text you to check in if I feel a little bit convicted and I want to see if you're struggling or something. It's not that kind of accountability. Accountability is important, and it's especially important with the Sabbath because, as I said earlier, our culture pushes us towards workaholism. Our culture glorifies the people that are swamped with work, that are too busy to do anything else. It's like, wow, man, they've got their life together. They don't have any time. They have got their life together. Our culture will push us towards that, and it's me too. I'll naturally go there. If no one's checking on me and say, hey man, have you spent time with God, How's your faith life going, Have you been praying? Have you been reading your Bible? Have you been making sure that you're following God's call on your life? If no one's checking in on me, if I'm not spending time doing that, my natural instinct is to go to those things, to go to the work that I have to do or the school that I have to do or try and plan things for ministry. That's my natural thing. The next thing I wanted to go to that's really practical, that changed a lot of my prayer life actually, is starting in worship. And guys, when you take your Sabbath day, if we get our rest from Jesus and if we get our rest from the identity we have in him, doesn't it make sense to reflect on that? It's so easy to have that self-reproach, thinking about ourselves and our lives and where we've gone wrong and where we've done this, but we forget that we have a new identity in Jesus. So that has changed my prayer life across the board, to be honest, not just on the Sabbath. But starting with worship, starting with recognizing Jesus, recognizing the work that he's done in your life, recognizing who he is and the identity we have in him, giving him praise. It's more than just on Sunday. Worship isn't just music. It's amazing and it's a great way, but you can also pray. You can talk. You can literally just sit in your room and talk to God. You can write down in your journal. So I would encourage you, another practical thing is to do worship. And finally, this one's really simple, pretty standard, but break from the normal. You know, if your normal thing every week, you're doing it on the Sabbath, you're not really setting aside that day. So I'm sure most of us don't work a job 7 days a week. Some of us do, though. So that would require setting apart one day where you don't follow the normal. If you play basketball on maybe the MAC basketball team, you're doing that full time. You're doing that every day of the week. What is something that is normally leisure to most people? That's your work. That's what you're doing every day. So on the Sabbath day, take a break from it. Change from the normal. Set that day apart for God. So those are some practical things, but to step into the Sabbath rest, you know, it takes putting time in your schedule first for God, putting God first, putting the goals that God has first, and spending time with him so you can hear those goals. And then it takes those practical things as well. I think Moses understood the Sabbath and time with God better than almost anybody else. In Deuteronomy, Moses is telling the Israelites these 10 commandments again. He got them first in Exodus. He's telling them again as they're on the banks of the Jordan River. You know, they're about to cross over into the promised land. And Moses isn't going with them. He's going to stay there. He's not going to the promised land with them. This is kind of the last chance he has to give these people, you know, the people that he's led, input and feedback. And so it's not just a small thing. He's not sitting there casually being like, well, maybe don't worship other gods. If I could give you some advice, you know, watch out. The river's kind of fast flowing. Yeah, steady footing. It's not just casual things. I think he's very, very intentional with his wording when he says, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. See, if you don't know about Moses was an Israelite who actually grew up in Pharaoh's palace. He grew up kind of as one of the sons of Pharaoh. Then he murdered an Egyptian and got driven out of Egypt. He fled to Midian. In Midian, he became a shepherd. He tended his father-in-law's flocks. He was kind of roaming around with his flocks one day, and I'm kind of cutting the story of Moses very short here. You can read a lot more about it. But the angel of the Lord appears to him in a burning bush, and as he approaches the burning bush, God speaks to him from the burning bush, and he says, Moses, take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. See, I don't think Moses is using the word holy lightly in there when he says, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Moses is talking about the presence of God. And Moses, more than anybody, I think, knows what the presence of God is. If you look at Moses' life from then on, when he steps into the presence of God, he goes and he leads a nation out of slavery. Not one person, not two people. He leads a nation out of slavery. He takes them across the desert, through the wilderness, and to the promised land. He performs miracle after miracle. God is walking with him. Moses is spending time in the presence of God. And when he says, keep the Sabbath day holy, I think he knows what he means. He's not saying to the people, go to church on Sunday, you know, do some Christian things, maybe read your Bible, post a picture of it on Instagram. You're good. No, he's saying, guys, it's the presence of God. Take a day apart. Spend time in God's presence. Moses understands this, and I'm going to go right now. This is one of my favorite scriptures in the whole Bible, and this is Moses' kind of conversation with God. I don't think it's coming up on here. I'm just going to give context quickly and read it. It's from Exodus 33, verse, I think, 14 to 16. But essentially, this is the first time Moses has brought down the 10 Commandments. He's chiseled them into the stone tablets. Comes down, Israelites are worshiping a golden calf. So they're worshiping a false god. He loses it. It's literally, he just spent time chiseling that rule. He's mad. He comes down and he's like, smashes them, loses it, ends up going back up the mountain. Again, I'm abbreviating the story. Please read about it. And he goes back up the mountain to God, and he's essentially begging God to go with him. God's saying, you guys can go to the promised land now, but I'm going to send an angel with you. I'm not going to go with you because you guys are worshiping other gods. And Moses is like, hold on, God. No. Who's going to lead us? You have to come with us. And that's where I'm going to pick up really quick. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anybody know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? I love this scripture so much because you see Moses, he's led these people for 40 years wandering in the desert. He's performed miracles. He's taken them out of slavery from the dominating nation of the time, and they've done all this stuff. He's led them all for the promised land. This is where they're going. This is their destination. This is what he's been working to. And he's there, and God literally looks at him and says, hey man, go. You can go to the promised land. And Moses is like, hold on. That's not what I'm after. He's like, God, we're not going unless your presence is with us. We're going to stay right here unless your presence is with us. Moses understood that what defined him was not where they were going. It was not, oh, the Israelites are here now. The Israelites have the promised land. He understood that what set them apart, what made them different from the people around them, was the presence of God. Moses was able to enter into that Sabbath rest because he understood it was with the presence of God. Moses found his rest. Moses' identity was rooted in God and spending time in his presence. Guys, the Sabbath day, it's something sometimes taken lightly, but this is an opportunity to set it apart. Spend time with God. You look at what God can do, what time in the presence of God can do. If you're not feeling rest, are you spending time with God? Are you letting God direct you? I think it really blows me away. I got a little bit excited there. I started yelling. But for real, guys, I wanted to open up this opportunity. I wanted to come and give a bit of a time to respond, actually, after this. And this is a response for me, too. This is something that affects me and that I've learned as I'm going through it, too, you know. So we'll do the classic raise your hands thing, but it's not something magical about sticking your hand up. It's a time to respond. It's a time to recognize God and say, God, I want to choose you. I want to move into this. You know, I've been lacking here, and I want to step into it. So maybe you're like me tonight, and maybe you've been going through it, and you've been trying to rest, and you've been serving God, and you're confused, and you don't know why, and you're not stepping into the real time in the presence. Maybe you're just not spending enough time with God, and you've broken it up, and you've put God second in your schedule. So if everybody could bow their heads, close their eyes, just so there's a little bit of privacy. Nothing magical about it, just for the privacy. And if that's you,